Hello, everybody. I'm Lisa Salzville. I'm with Vermont Coverts. Welcome all to our talk tonight. Tonight, we're talking turkey with Matt DiBona from the Wild Turkey Federation. I'm going to pass it over to Matt in just a moment. I just ask that you keep your microphones muted so that we don't have the background noise. If you have any questions, please just type them in the chat box and I'll relay them to Matt at the end. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Matt. Go ahead, take it away.
All right, thanks, Lisa. Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt DiBona, and I'm the New England District Biologist with the National Wild Turkey Federation. And excited to be able to get in front of you guys because this is a pretty important time of year as far as wild turkeys are concerned. And I just wanted to take some time tonight to talk to you about turkeys, maybe transfer some of my enthusiasm over to you guys, and hopefully share some tips and ways that you can help manage your property for turkeys and other wildlife. Turkeys are something that are pretty ubiquitous today, but I don't want to date myself or anybody else in the audience here, but I don't remember seeing turkeys when I was a young kid, and today I can see them almost any day of the week. And so it's quite a conservation success story, but it didn't come easy and it's not necessarily guaranteed. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint presentation here. If I can get this to work, go to share. All right, and is that?
We're seeing the screen. Working? It's not in presentation mode yet. Now it's in presentation mode. You're all set, Matt.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to cover a little bit about the turkey reintroduction. I'm going to spend more time talking about some of the breeding biology and habitat requirements of these birds, because I think that that's where more action is needed, and perhaps where folks like yourself can play a role, and talk a little bit about habitat practices that are going to benefit turkeys. Turkeys, they're not a keystone species, but they are most likely an umbrella species because they are a habitat generalist, but they are dependent on forest and field habitat. And what we do to manage habitat for turkeys often benefits a broad suite of wildlife. And so when I'm working in New England, working on habitat conservation programs, there's not a lot of conservation grant dollars out there for wild turkeys, but there is grant money for doing young forest work, for doing pollinator habitat, and those types of practices that benefit those species also benefit turkeys. So there is a lot of value in trying to manage your property for turkeys. So turkeys were not around when I was a kid, or at least not very common. They were once very prevalent. At one point, there were over 11 million turkeys throughout their range. They were a very important resource during initial European colonization, but as forests were cleared and turkeys were over-harvested, they largely disappeared from the landscape, and they were removed from New England during the late 1800s, and it stayed that way for a long time. The first attempts to restore turkeys to the landscape in the 1950s, they failed miserably because they relied heavily on using pen-raised birds. And unfortunately, those birds didn't do well in the wild. They just couldn't deal with predators. And so new techniques were developed that involved capturing wild turkeys in other parts of their range and relocating them to states that had sufficient habitat but didn't have any populations. And so in Vermont, as with a lot of New England, a lot of our birds ended up coming from New York, from the Allegheny State Park, if any of you have been out there in Western New York. And through an initial series of reintroductions in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Vermont's turkey population was kind of reborn. And once those initial releases took place, what they did was they ended up moving a lot of birds around to different parts of the state. And through time, the population really thrived. And what we found was, there's a lot of concern initially when some of this initial restoration work was talking about was, hey, there's not enough forest. Turkeys need so much forest to survive. It'll never happen. And what we found is turkeys really adapted to this human influence landscape. And there certainly is a lot of forest habitat in New England, but there's also a tremendous amount of fields, and turkeys have seemed to do pretty well even in residential areas that we thought turkeys couldn't exist. And even in the northernmost parts of Maine, there's turkeys now. So a really hardy bird. So much so that within a few years of reintroduction, we had our first hunting season in Vermont. And today on average, we're harvesting roughly 6,000 birds in Vermont throughout spring and fall seasons. One thing that's pretty unique, our spring hunting season just ended. It typically occurs during the month of May. It's almost solely harvest of male birds. It's the regulation reads it has to be a bearded bird, and only a small percentage of hens actually have beards. So a lot of that harvest pressure is focused on males, and that's very deliberate because it allows us to sort of protect the investment of that turkey population and give hens a chance to lay that next generation of birds. So I'm going to pivot here and talk a little bit about turkey biology and behavior. A lot of times, winter is when we see the biggest flocks of birds. I'm sure everybody's driven along the roads in winter, seeing these really large flocks of birds. And what happens is, as spring starts to come, late March, early April, we start to see those winter flocks break up into smaller groups of jakes, which are juvenile males, adult males, which we call toms, and then you'll see flocks of hens. The adult hens, I guess they're just called hens, juvenile hens we call jennies. So they start to split off into these different groups, and turkeys, like other wildlife, have a social dominance or social pecking order. And that sort of relates to a lot of the way that they go through the reproductive season, where males are out there in a field displaying for hens. It's typically the dominant males that do the majority of the breeding. And I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this out in a field where you will see toms out there strutting, tails all fanned out, neck all tucked down, and you might hear them gobbling. The hens typically are very choosy. They choose the male to whether or not they'll breed. If the hen is successful, or the male is successful, the hen will lead him off to the woods. They'll copulate. Interestingly, the hen may copulate with multiple males. She's actually able to store the semen for, I think, up to a couple of weeks. And so she can actually fertilize the eggs with semen from different gobblers. So that's actually a strategy to increase diversity. So this time of year, the breeding season, if there's a bottleneck on turkey populations, it is undoubtedly the breeding season. The females assume all the risk for nesting and raising young. The males will just go off and form bachelor flocks after breeding. That's why we're actually still able to hunt them. We time our season to begin in the beginning of May. Well, it's May 1st in Vermont. Typically late April, May in most parts of New England and the Northeast. And that's because we try to time the harvest after reproduction has occurred, after the hen has laid most of her eggs, and hopefully she is about to start incubating or already incubating eggs before we ever start hunting. So we're really protecting that investment in the next generation before we start shooting males. I'm going to talk a lot more in depth about nesting habitat, but basically, any other season out of the year, hens and males, all turkeys roost in trees at night. It provides a lot of safety from predators, gets them off the ground. However, turkeys nest on the ground during the spring. And so that's where hens are really under threat from predators. Now, there's a thing with nesting habitat where we have some ideas about what hens are looking for with nesting habitat. They need some sort of overhead structure, cover, that sort of thing, but it's sort of a Goldilocks syndrome where it can't be too little cover and that predators can easily locate them, and it can't be too thick because the hens still need to be able to escape on the off chance that a predator stumbles across them. They lay 1 egg per day. Their clutch size varies, but typically figure around 11 or 12 eggs in a nest. Basically, they pick out a site. They're going to start picking it out in say mid-April, most likely. You think about what Vermont looks like in mid-April. They scrape out a shallow depression and just start laying those eggs. After they've laid all the eggs, they start incubating full time for 28 days. Now, what's interesting is, and this is, I think, originally explained to me by Mike Chamberlain, a researcher from the South, is here's the best way to think about it. Turkeys have a home range of, roughly, 1,000, 2,000 acres, depending on the habitat. During the nesting season, their home range is reduced to about 20 acres. That's the equivalent of having a 2,400 square foot house and then having to spend a month locked in the bathroom. You have to have everything you need to survive in that area. That hen spends almost all of those 28 days on the nest. She'll get off a little bit in the mornings or in the evenings to take some food or water, but that's it. And so you can imagine that her risk of being detected by predators goes up each day that she's on that nest, because she's putting out scent. And there's just a greater probability of a predator actually eventually detecting her and finding her or that nest. And some hens behave differently. Some hens, at the first sign of danger, they'll cut and run. They're the hens that live to nest another day, but they're also the ones that typically produce fewer broods over their lifetime. And then there are those hens that really stick to that nest tight and run a greater risk of getting predated, but conversely also have a greater chance of successfully pulling off a brood. And there's everything in between in terms of behavior and stuff. And so you can imagine the high risk involved. Turkeys have a lot of adaptations to sort of avoid predation. They have phenomenal eyesight. Except for the nesting season, they tend to hang out in groups. That's more sets of eyes, more odds that the predator is going to get your buddy instead of you. But that's no guarantee that they're going to escape predation. And there's everything under the sun that comes after turkeys and their nests. We're talking owls, snakes, they're a big predator of nests, raccoons, foxes, the list goes on. And it's not over once they hatch. So she's laying one egg a day. Despite that difference in egg laying, all those eggs, once she starts incubating them, synchronize, and they all end up hatching within 24 hours of each other. As soon as those chicks are hatched and up and moving, they're moving. They're on the road. She's taking them away from the nest, away from all that scent and evidence, and moving them to brooding habitat. We'll talk more about what that is, but ideally it's located fairly close to where she's nesting. That's the best case scenario, but she will take them up to a quarter of a mile away. Remember, these are just little puffballs like the size of sparrows. And they're not out of the woods yet. Those first 14 days of life are the most dangerous for poults because they cannot fly. So when she's shielding them, she's kind of nurturing them, herding them along as they're eating. And this brood habitat is a little bit different from the nesting habitat in that it has a more of a herbaceous vegetation content. It has hopefully high insect populations because those birds really need that protein to grow, and they grow really fast. Like I said, when they're just starting out, they're the size of a small sparrow, but a month later they're the size of a quail. At 10 weeks they're a pheasant. They look like a turkey. Once they get past that initial 2 weeks, they have a lot better chance of survival. They're able to fly enough to get up off the ground at night. They have a little bit more ability to regulate their temperature. One of the biggest concerns, and this is just an example of brood habitat, you can see all the herbaceous vegetation there. Nice little forest opening makes great brood habitat. Temperature and precipitation can still be an issue for these newly hatched birds, and the timing of that weather is equally critical. If you think about the rain we had over the Memorial Day weekend, that was a pretty significant rainfall event occurring right around the time when we think these chicks are probably hatching. So if hens start incubating the beginning of May, 28 days later, usually that first week of June is a big hatch week. So if we're getting a lot of rain right at the end of May, at the beginning of June, that can have really serious impacts on poult survival. These birds don't have fully feathered coats yet, right? So if they get wet from a severe rainstorm, they can become hypothermic in a 50-degree day, and die. Similarly, if it gets colder than that, and we had some funky weather going on the last couple weeks, it can be really difficult. So, as we see more chaotic weather or unpredictable weather events, those stand to have an impact on turkey productivity because it can severely impact poult survival. Like I said, after 14 days, things really improve for them. The main point I want to leave you with is this idea of 70%. So not every hen is going to nest every year. Part of it is their age. Younger immature hens, jennies, not all of them, only a small percentage of them are going to actually nest. If a hen's coming out of a really hard winter and she's not in good physiological condition, she may put off nesting, or she may lay a smaller clutch, or she may be more inclined to abandon the nest just because of the physiological strain. So only 80% will attempt to nest in a given year. Now, out of that, only a quarter, sometimes less, the range is somewhere around like 20 to 40% of those nests are actually going to hatch out one or more poults. And I mentioned all those factors that are after those birds. It's not just the weather. All those predators are constantly out there searching for those birds or another food source during those first 2 weeks. Excuse me. So what we find is really only 35% of poults will live to be a month old. When you start to do all that math, it boils down to only 7% of hens will have at least one poult survive to the fall in a given year. And so, there's a lot of factors at play with what's going on with turkeys. Now, I feel pretty confident that turkeys in New England are doing well. That's not the case in other parts of the range. Even nearby neighbors like New York and Pennsylvania are seeing some indications that their turkey populations are declining, because they're seeing declining harvest, or they're seeing declines in turkey productivity. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways we collect productivity data. I don't know what the real reason is behind that, but it's likely a combination of factors, whether it's a more fragmented landscape, whether habitat quality and availability has declined through time, whether predator populations have increased. One of the anecdotal things we hear about is when a lot of the reintroduction stuff was going on in New York during the 90s, that was also when there was a severe rabies outbreak in New York, which likely suppressed predator populations, and they've rebounded since then. So, there's likely a combination of factors that are putting pressure on these birds, potentially affecting the sustainability of the population. And our ability to control them, we can control things like harvest pressure, though I'm not sure how much harvest is contributing to things. But one of the other things we can try to address is habitat quality. And, I spent a lot of time talking about how hard it is to be a hen and pull off a brood. If we can make better nesting habitat and better brood habitat, we might go a long way towards sustaining turkey populations and making sure that the turkey populations we have today are there tomorrow. So I kind of want to pivot and start talking about some of these habitat characteristics. What makes good nesting habitat? I said these birds start nesting in mid-April, right? That's when they're finding a nest site. And we like to think that, turkeys have been scouting this out all winter. They picked the perfect spot. And some radio telemetry data that we have on hens suggests that they may only start looking like a day ahead of time, or even hours ahead of time of when they're set to lay that first nest or first egg for what kind of nest area they want to nest in. And if you think about what Vermont looks like in mid-April, there's not, vegetation hasn't leafed out yet, and there's not necessarily a lot of cover. So their options are limited. And if we have good existent remnant cover from the previous season, that can be a good starting point for turkey habitat. Now, that could be anything from, a blackberry thicket to a stand of shrubs. I actually have an image up here of bush honeysuckle, And I'm not advocating for invasive species. Strongly encourage you guys to do invasive species removal. But have a consideration if on your property all you really have for understory cover is a stand of invasive species, whether it's honeysuckle or barberry or multiflora, you may want to not like remove an entire 2-acre patch of invasive species in one go. Instead, you may want to stagger your removal over a couple years so that as you're eliminating that structure, you have an opportunity to replace it with some native shrub plantings. Maybe you do the following season, so that we make sure that there's something there for them that initial, during that initial nesting period. Now, things greatly improve a month later, right? When everything has really leafed out more, and then more things start to look like potential turkey habitat, whether it's an old meadow, an abandoned pasture, or a field, or a small patch cut. You can see how much more structure and cover there is. And again, like I said, none of us can really see into the mind of a turkey, but seeing there, where there is some cover, that could potentially shield her from owls, whether there's something to the topography that maybe pushes scent away from her, that can minimize predator detection. If you have any of those features on your property, if you have some old fields that are grown up, if you can maintain that or do other plantings to encourage those shrubby underlayers, that's going to go a long way towards improving habitat quality for nesting. Now, the other side of the equation is brood habitat. I mentioned in an ideal scenario that she's nesting maybe just a couple 100 feet away from a forest edge that opens up into a nice herbaceous meadow or a field or something like that. That may not be the case, but take a look at what's on your property, think about what's on your neighbor's property and how you can kind of synergize for maximum benefits. Maybe you have a right-of-way corridor moving through your property, or maybe you have a real interest in doing a pollinator garden. The way we think about brood habitat, which I think may be one of the more limiting habitat factors on the landscape, that's truly a situation where you need that herbaceous cover, right? The litmus test for brood habitat is, get on your belly and look around. And if you can sort of visualize being a little puffball, a little tennis ball sized thing, and walking through that, that's probably good habitat. If it's thicker than that, it's probably not the best brood habitat. By the same standpoint, if you roll over on your back and you look up and you're like, can you see any type of escape cover that you could quickly get underneath to get away from a raptor? Ideally, you have little pockets of shrubs or other stuff scattered throughout that field that's going to help you. If you don't, that might be an option that you can improve upon. The same thing is, it can't be something that's like 5 or 6 feet tall, because that hen needs to be kind of able to stretch up and look around and see the danger coming. So you can see the kind of conundrum that you're in, where it has to have some woody stuff, but it can't be too dense. It needs to be open enough so that birds can move, but thick enough so that it provides some cover and as well as supports those insect populations that they're there to forage on. So these are just some examples. This is a site on the Green Mountain National Forest. We were doing some pollinator work a couple of years ago, looking for some areas to enhance, and this was a candidate site. And we walked out there and just saw, all the blackberry and all the goldenrod that was growing up, and we're kind of like, can't really improve on this. This is phenomenal habitat for pollinators, and it's really good habitat for turkeys. So we ended up going somewhere else. But if you have a fallow field on your property, it doesn't have to be as big as this. That's phenomenal for turkeys, and it's phenomenal for a variety of other wildlife. Your other option for brood habitat, and some of you may have seen it if you were, if you go for walks, in the woods this time of year, old logging roads, old landings, this is a perfect place for a hen to just take her brood to forage for a couple hours. And that can be an opportunity for you to do some habitat enhancement work if you have those features, but maybe don't necessarily have the vegetation that you're looking for. Now, excuse me, how do we make better stuff? How do we make better nesting habitat if we don't already have it? One of the easiest things to do is to soften field edges, what we call feathering edges, edge feathering. And you can see the photo on the left has a really hard edge transition between forest and field. One of the simplest things you can do, it takes a little bit of sweat equity, but go out there and figure the initial 50 feet from that field edge into the woods is where you're going to work. And right up against that edge, you're going to maybe take that first 15 feet, first 20 feet, and just drop almost everything. Drop all the trees and just let them lay parallel to the field edge. And all of a sudden, you've just created a bunch of cover. And what that also does is that disturbance is letting more sunlight onto the ground. And that's, in a lot of ways, how you're going to encourage a more robust understory. That next 15 feet, you're not going to remove everything. You might only remove 70% of the trees, maybe get it down to 70% basal area, or sorry, 30% basal area, or maybe you just take down all the larger standing trees and leave the shrubs. Again, you're creating this other layer, this transition layer between field and forest. And for that last 15 feet, maybe you just remove whatever, if there's some undesirable trees, maybe there's some good mass trees there, you're going to leave those and cut down some of the rest. So maybe you only go down to 70% basal area on that last third. But that 50 to 60 feet of habitat that you've impacted, you've all of a sudden created a transition point that's going to completely change the vegetation that you see growing and create a lot more cover for that bird to nest. And you've done it against a field edge so that bird has brooding habitat right nearby. Now, one of the other ways we can get to really good nesting habitat is through doing even age management. And, I'm sure some of you have probably, had some experience with patch cuts for wildlife. It's definitely, sort of a shock, and some folks are resistant to do it. But it can be one of the biggest changes to your property for the better by diversifying that forest landscape and increasing some structural and age diversity in your forest. Now you can see here with this cut, it looks rough. I mean, there's no and if or buts about it. But one of the interesting things that was done was a lot of the downed woody debris was left on site, and that was intentional to encourage regeneration, especially in areas where you have high deer densities, making that property initially unattractive to deer, making it difficult for them to get in there and forage on all those stem sprouts that you're going to see. Can really help improve the quality of the regeneration you're going to get. And incidentally, that creates really good immediate cover for turkeys nesting, the following spring. But what's an important point that I always try to communicate with folks is how different a little bit of time makes. Now, as you can see, this is the same area 1 year later. You can see the amount of vegetative growth that's come in from stump sprouts, from a lot of the early successional vegetation that's starting to come up. And as that matures and gets better, it gets better and better, and it can function in multiple ways. So, in the early years, a patch cut can have a lot of benefits for broods. But then as some of that cover starts to develop better, it can really create some better nesting habitat as well. And you can see here, this was a cut from another area in Vermont that was a few years older. And you can see some of the residual or some of the woody vegetation that's come up, some of the residual vegetation that was left, and then a ton of herbaceous vegetation. So that's functioning on multiple levels, multiple benefits for turkey. And incidentally, there's a broad suite of 30 to 50 species of wildlife that need more young forest habitat. I'm sure some of you that are on this call have heard a lot of this stuff before. But turkeys is one more reason to do it. And if you do it for turkeys, you're going to do it for a bunch of wildlife, and vice versa. If you're doing it for other wildlife, you're making great habitat for turkeys. So pat yourself on the back. If you're not, if you're more interested in doing brood habitat, you kind of have your forest, your woodlot under control, you have several options available. The first is forest openings. It's a critical component of the forest landscape. It's something that's very important in small amounts. It's something where maybe you only have like a 1 acre opening on a 20 acre piece of woods. But just that 1 acre is going to change and increase the amount of food that's available for a lot of wildlife, whether it's turkey or bear or deer. And it really brings a lot of diversity, and it kind of gives you a sandbox to play in. This is another example of a forest opening. This is actually a project area on the Gale Meadows Wildlife Management Area, where I think we're going to do some tree plantings and some pollinator plots next year. But a forest opening is something that you can kind of do it one of two ways. You can make the opening and walk away from it, and you'll see the succession happen, and it will definitely have a lot of benefit for turkeys. Or you can choose to maintain it as a permanent opening, and then it's really putting it on a mowing cycle of probably not more than every 3 years. And some folks will choose to mow it every year. Excuse me. So if you already have this feature on the landscape, there's definitely a lot of benefit in retaining it versus just letting it go back to woods. But again, part of this is looking through the lens of zooming out on your property, looking on Google and just seeing, hey, what do I have? What does my neighbor have? What can I do to make things better for turkeys versus trying to have everything for turkeys on your property? Another great candidate for brood habitat are log landings. There's a disturbed site already. It might need a little bit of cleaning up, and most likely your forester is recommending that you put down some sort of cover seed when the harvest is done to get some of that soil held together and keep it from washing out. You have options at that point. You can go with a traditional agway conservation mix, or you can choose to play around a little bit and do something more food plot oriented or pollinator oriented. Some people cringe when I start talking about food plots, and what I'll say is, listen, it's your sandbox with what you want to do, and food plots are going to provide a lot of high quality forage that hopefully they are going to attract deer to your property, or they're going to attract other wildlife for either viewing or hunting. But those other 50 weeks out of the year, that food plot can be providing a lot of habitat benefit to a lot of other species and feed a lot of those deer throughout the year. And food plots can come in, and there's all shapes and sizes. A lot of them can be annual based, and you could just be throwing down oats, or you could be putting down something like more intensive like a corn. You could go with a perennial food plot, and that's using clover or a clover based mix that maybe has something like chicory or alfalfa in it. And if you're maintaining that food plot properly, you're out there, you're mowing it once or twice a growing season, you're doing your liming and fertilizing periodically, you can get 5 years out of that food plot, no problem. And it just adds a little bit of variety. A lot of what we're talking about with turkey habitat is just introducing that disturbance and variety to the landscape. Now, on the other end of the spectrum is there's a big push right now with pollinators. And those pollinator mixes, if you've ever looked at them, they contain a nice mix of warm season grasses, of wildflowers, all those, those bunch grasses and, those herbaceous wildflowers. That creates just the kind of structure you want for brood habitats and for those poults to be able to get around easily and forage for insects. So that can be a fantastic, it can be it takes some work to establish, but they can be gorgeous. And then you're just putting it on a normal management cycle where every few years you're mowing it to maintain the vegetation and kind of limiting woody intrusion. So, I think there's a lot of opportunities that you may have on your property to enhance existing features. You don't necessarily need to go in there and do a patch cut, though I strongly, if it makes sense with your forester and the property that you have, it's a great wildlife friendly practice. But then there's really small enhancements you can do to your property just to make it more attractive to turkey broods. A lot of you probably have fields on your property. There's ways to make them better, or at a minimum, just making sure that they maintain those characteristics and benefits that they already have. Now, the other side of the equation is food. I think turkeys eat almost anything. They're definitely a habitat generalist when it comes to food. But a turkey in Maryland probably leads a different life than a turkey that lives in Vermont or New Hampshire. Our winters get pretty severe, and food can be a pretty significant limiting factor, and winter severity can be a pretty limiting factor. If it snows, turkeys can deal with snow, providing it's not super powdery. If it's snow that forms and it forms a nice crust on it, and those birds can move around, they'll travel and they'll find their food and they'll be okay. If we have a deep powdery snow, those birds really can't walk around. That's their primary. I mean, they got wings, but I mean, their primary form of locomotion is walking. And so otherwise they're forced to just kind of sit in a tree, huddle up, and kind of wait it out. So the amount of food that we can provide to these birds during the fall and winter really helps their body condition, particularly for hens going into the breeding season. I mentioned earlier, hen needs to be going into the breeding season with some meat on her bones, because it's really hard those 28 days when she's just hunkered tight. She's eating and drinking, but just the bare essentials to survive. So increasing food for wildlife, for turkeys, is another easy way to improve your property for wildlife. Now, I'm very curious. I'm sure some of you guys, maybe during the question session, and if you guys have questions, please be putting them in the comments, and I'll make sure to get to them after I finish talking here. I'm sure a lot of you have apple trees on your property or some other kind of fruit tree. And in some cases, you may have planted them. In some cases, they may have been buried in your woodlot and you just stumbled across them. And a lot of you know the story of apple trees, that they're sort of just a holdover from previous land use within Vermont. But it's sort of a hidden treasure. And in a lot of cases, these apple trees are still producing fruit. They're still alive. And with a little bit of care and management, you can really bring them back and increase the vigor and production of these trees. So in a lot of cases, what we're doing is we're going into the woods, and we need to, what we say, release those trees, which means we need to remove some of the competing vegetation that is shading these trees out. They are sunlight loving plants. So you can see in this little diagram here on the left, particularly on the southern facing exposure, if there are trees that are overshadowing the canopy of that apple tree, we want to get rid of them. And some folks, it's sort of a question mark, why am I cutting down this tree or that tree and stuff? Those are decisions you need to make. Do I sacrifice a good oak tree for a beat up apple tree? Maybe not. If I have a really good stand of pine or hemlock that are providing some thermal shelter and maybe a place for deer or other wildlife to huddle up in the storm, I may not want to remove them. But if all I have is some maple, or a birch that's kind of smothering out an apple tree, well, it might be a no-brainer for me to go in there and remove those trees and get more daylight on that apple tree. And it's something that it's a multi-year investment. Increasing sunlight drastically like that to that tree is a shock to the system. And so you have to do it and give them a season to adjust to it. So in addition to removing any overstory competition for sunlight, I'm going to remove anything that I have growing up underneath that tree out to the drip line. And just that one change, you're increasing airflow, you're increasing sunlight, you're changing the temperature dynamics around that tree. That's a big shock to the system. You release an apple tree, walk away for the season, and then come back the next year and start looking at the branches on that tree and figure out which ones you need to remove. Let's get rid of the dead ones. Let's get rid of the weak ones. Let's remove some of those God, I'm blanking on the word right now, but when you get the water line with the trees coming up, the water sprouts, get rid of them, pick the best branches that are going to support the fruit. And in general, you don't want to remove more than a third of a canopy at a time. So the one picture that I have up here is an example from the Whipple Hollow WMA. out near Brandon, Vermont. And back there, there's a spot that has a ton of apple trees, like, more apple trees concentrated in a spot than I've seen in a long time. And we went in there and did a lot of release work, removed a lot of the understory and competing vegetation. We girdled a bunch of trees that were kind of, growing above them. And I walked back there earlier this spring, and we've kind of reached a decision point where we probably need to go back in there and now start picking which apple trees we want to keep and which ones we want to remove, because there are almost too many apple trees growing out there and they're kind of competing with each other for resources. So those are the kind of decisions you're going to have to make. And I will add that, I'm hopeful now that maybe the world's going back to normal. My goal is to work with Lisa and other partners in the state to do some apple tree release workshops out in the field, give you guys a chance to, get your hands dirty, work on some trees, and take some of that knowledge back to your own woodlot for how you can apply it. So, stay tuned for some of that stuff. Aside from apple trees, look at the trees you have on your property and figure out what are the species, what are the trees that you have that have the best chance of producing food resources for wildlife. When we're talking about increasing food for wildlife, I'm really conservative. I'm not betting everything on that one stand of oaks that I have, or that one stand of beech, or the couple hickories that if I only have one thing on my property, I'm putting all my eggs in one basket. And what I really want to do is I want to spread the risk throughout my woods. I want to encourage all the different food sources that I have, because in any given year, you never know what's going to happen with weather or disease or animal browse or whatever. Something may not, acorns may not produce this year, but if I know that I have a stand of beech, maybe the beech will produce this year, or maybe, the black cherry will have a good year. The more variety I'm encouraging, the best trees that I'm encouraging, I'm hedging the bets that no matter what the fall or winter brings, I'm going to have food there for my wildlife to support them. And so mass tree release, very similar to the apple tree release. This is an example of doing it on oaks. Again, just removing competing vegetation around those best trees that either have, and this is something that obviously you might be doing anyway, as doing some timber stand improvement work, selecting the best trees on your property. Those best oaks are likely also going to produce some of the best acorns. So that's a very wildlife friendly practice that can benefit your property and the economic value of your timber. Now, if you don't have those good species there, you got to go to plan B, and you got to be willing to plant some. And I think that that's where you can easily enhance, whether it's your old log landing, or you have a field on your property that you want to do something with. And this is where I would go. Varieties, the spice of life. Plant some trees, plant shrubs, plant some dogwoods, plant some hawthorn, some hazelnut. Have some fun with it. Plant serviceberry. Make something pretty. Make a variety of different fruits that are going to be available for those animals, so that they have not only a variety of soft mast, but they have a variety of hard mast. And I think that it's really, like I said, this is where I think it's fun, where it's a sandbox where you can really experiment with the different things that you want to grow. That about wraps up, my recommendations on stuff. There's certain things that I didn't go into, other practices, but that was sort of the 35,000 foot level. There's two other things that I want to put on your radar, and this kind of goes back to how we monitor our turkey populations. Every year, Vermont Fish and Wildlife runs a summer turkey survey, and this is something that NWTF helps out with. This year's a little bit differently. In previous years, we were really focused around the month of August, and we're expanding that window to cover July 1st to August 31st. And what we're really interested in is you reporting your turkey sightings to Fish and Wildlife, because every time you report a hen with a group of poults, or you report, even just as importantly, lone hens with no poults, that gives us a piece of information. It tells us, how production was in your backyard or on your way to work. And if we get enough of those observations, and we'll get, routinely over 1,000 observations every year, we can develop a statewide estimate of productivity and index, and it's typically expressed as like a poult to hen ratio. But that's a real easy citizen science project that gives us a really neat snapshot of how production was. For instance, I'll use last year as an example. Last year, weather conditions were really favorable to production. We had decent temperatures, nothing too crazy, didn't get super cold, didn't get super warm, had some rain, but no big giant sustained precipitation events. Production last year, all indications were was very good. And anecdotally, during this past hunting season, we had lots of folks reporting jakes and that sort of thing. So when the final harvest data is compiled, it'll be interesting to see if we saw a larger proportion of jakes in the harvest or not. But what's even more interesting is oftentimes, this year's jakes will be 2 years old going into the hunting season in 2022. And those 2-year-old birds often form the largest age class of the turkey harvest. And so if we had really good production 2 years earlier, we might have a really strong spring turkey season. So it's just another piece of data that wildlife managers can use to manage the flock. Encourage you guys to participate. I know you'll be seeing some information on it if you guys follow Vermont Fish and Wildlife, if you're on their email newsletter or their Facebook page. Certainly if you're on the NWTF Facebook page, we'll be talking about it. The other thing that I wanted to put on your radar is I will be doing a habitat walk next Saturday in Mount Holly. There's a private landowner that we're working with. They've done several different habitat practices on their property, and we have a neat opportunity. I'm working with a consultant who on the side does a lot of food plot work, and he's like, hey, yeah, bring some folks out. We'll talk food plots. He's actually going to be planting a food plot next Saturday. So it's a really neat opportunity to just see what goes into it. It's a great chance to ask questions to somebody that does this for a living. What to plant, how to plant it. How much, do I need to get a soil test done? How much lime and fertilizer should I use? And a chance to see it done and what kind of equipment you need or don't need. And we'll also have a chance to tour the property and see some other practices like some apple tree release work, some mass tree release, and some invasive species control. So we're hoping for nice weather next Saturday. It's figure 9 to 11. You can stay as long as you like there. If you're interested in learning more about that event, you can go to our webpage. That's nwtf.org/events. Or if you're on Facebook, find us at NWTF Vermont. My information is right here on the right side of the screen. I have my email here and my phone number. And Alicia or Lisa, maybe you can put that in the chat as well. If you folks are interested in having me come out and look at your property, just getting another set of eyes on it, maybe making some recommendations, I'd be happy to do that. If it's beyond what I can do, or you're interested in doing some bigger things, I can certainly help connect you with folks at Fish and Wildlife or NRCS to find out about some of the landowner assistance programs that are available to you and some of the technical assistance that NWTF or ourselves or Fish and Wildlife can offer. So with that, that's all I have for prepared stuff. If anybody has any questions or comments, I would be happy to take them at this time.
So my first question for you, or not even question, I'm saying I'm ready for a summer workshop, and we're gonna like crawl and see if it's good for little tennis ball puffballs.
Oh my God!
And then we're gonna lay on our back and see what it looks like. I think that's a great way to do the workshop. Just get down and dirty,
That's we'll hose you down with permethrin before you do it, guys, and don't worry, nobody will get ticks, I swear.
That's right. Well, I can't worry too much about it, right? Just got to do my best to be prepared.
I think that's great. Maybe we'll hide like some little prizes or something like that out there in the field. So
I like it. Alicia's actually wondering, can the public see the results of the summer brood surveys, and when is that information shared?
It might be available. I think one of the things we're hoping to do is we're working with Fish and Wildlife to just do some promotion of the survey leading up to the July 1 rollout. And I think part of that will be promoting the statistics from the previous year and maybe some longer term average stuff. So, typically that poult to hen ratio, the rule of thumb is, anytime you have a poult to hen ratio above 3, so 3 poults per hen on average, it's indicative of a population that's, doing well, stable to increasing and stuff. And I think in most years, Vermont's survey ratio is well above 3, like, in the 3s or the 4s and stuff. So we'll definitely get some of those statistics out to folks in the lead up to it. And I certainly, Chris Bernier's the turkey project leader with Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and loves talking turkey, and I'm sure he would gladly entertain a phone call from anybody that wanted to talk about the brood survey. So
there's a question here. What percentage of the population is here now as compared to 1960? And 100% more, right?
percent more. Yeah, 100% more. So, basically turkeys disappeared right in the late 1800s. And, if you think about what was going on with Vermont's landscape, we started to have a lot of farm abandonment and farm reversion right at the end of the 18th century, end of the 19th century. It's getting up to the 1900s, right? So right around there, you had a lot of farmland reversion, and as the landscape reverted to forest, it started to create the conditions that would support turkeys again, because while they don't need thousands and thousands of acres of forest, they need that mosaic of habitats between forest and fields to be able to survive. So turkeys disappeared, came back in roughly the late 60s, very beginning of the 70s, with those 31 birds that were brought in from New York.
So Cindy also asked, and the answer to this one is fun too. Didn't someone want the turkey to be the national bird at one time?
I believe that Ben Franklin was I think that may have been debunked, but there was definitely a story going around. I can remember hearing that Ben Franklin was really angling for the turkey to be the national bird, which would have been okay with me. But no, I hopefully somehow turkey will get the recognition it deserves.
So with the weather we've been having right now, what are you thinking for brood production, right? Are we looking all right, even though it's been rainy and cold, or are we a little concerned?
I would be a little concerned, but, I think that, we've had the same kind of weather creep up every couple of years in Vermont, and I would say the turkey populations are doing fine. I think it's when you have consistent, 2 to 3 years of bad production where you have to start to, where you might actually start to be like, I don't see turkeys around as often as I used to. But, turkeys are a species, anytime you have one of those, boom bust reproductive strategies and stuff, they tend to bounce back pretty quickly if weather conditions are conducive and stuff. So one bad year, just a bump in the road. I think, the weather conditions, like I said, I actually live down in Massachusetts. We got a lot of rain. I'm glad I wasn't going on vacation. I assume that you guys probably got, pretty similar amounts of rain and stuff. And if we had another set of storms like that, this week, then I think you might see a lot of nest or brood failures. That's not the end of the world, though, the end of the world, because it's early enough in the season that these birds would re-nest. And it's not uncommon for birds to nest a second time, sometimes even nest a third time if all other factors are good. So all's not lost if that first hatch fails.
Great. So there's a question about the species you suggested planting. Can any of those be planted under a fairly closed overstory, or does the area have to be opened up for them to be able to produce?
I would say most of them do best in a sunlight. Most of them are somewhat shade intolerant. So I would say planting them, in an open area would be good. But I can certainly dig around and see what might be a good shade tolerant species to plant. Some of those have some shade tolerance built into them, but if I was doing it, I would want to plant them in as much sunlight in an open field if I could, where I had good exposure. So I can try to come up with some recommendations. If you have that folks name, I'll pass it on to you.
Sure, that sounds good. Okay, Mary Beth notes, we hunt in the spring. We have hens roosting at night and we see hens walking around by themselves. Are they hens that are not nesting that year?
It could be, yeah. So I mean, the hens will roost in the trees with the males until they're bred and start nesting. Now, everything happens in a, you know, on a gradient and in a dynamic and stuff, right? So those hens that go off and nest, if that nest fails, they may not choose to nest again, and then they go back to living the turkey lifestyle of roosting in trees at night. There is also that population of juvenile females. You know, I think somewhere only around 30% of those juvenile females will actually nest in a given year. So yeah, it's either, if you're seeing lone hens and they're roosted up in trees at night, they are either juvenile hens or failed nesters.
Okay. When a brood area is mowed periodically, when would the earliest time in the year for mowing without disturbing that season's brood, or in my question addition, other nesting birds?
Right. I would say if you could give it till July 15th, that would be ideal. You know, the rule of thumb for a, you know, I mean, obviously if I could say August 15th, that'd be super, right? That'd cover the whole spectrum. But if I really wanted to protect those nesting birds, I would say through July 15th, because that would give that first round of nesting, you know, it gives those poults will be up and moving and fully mobile and able to fly and escape. But July 15th would really help with a lot of the second nest attempts as well. So that would be my recommendation if you can hold off to July 15th. And I recognize that depending on what your operation is, if you're trying to hay and that sort of thing, that's not realistic. But where you have that option, that's what I would recommend.
And for those of you that are in the Champlain Valley, there's the Bobolink project, which can help pay for you do an early mowing and then you do a really late mowing, and it helps. There's some cost share involved so that it supplements that loss of that mid mowing that you might do. That's more for bobolinks, but it would affect obviously the brood habitat of the turkey as well.
Yep, absolutely.
So that's something to think about. Well, that's it in the chat box, and we're rounding on 7:30. So I'd like to respect all of your time and wish you a good evening. Thank you for joining us. Matt, thank you so much for the presentation tonight. If you all do have any questions, you can email Matt or myself, and we look forward to seeing you on a future event and hopefully soon in person. As Matt said, he has an in-person event coming up, as do we. You'll see that in the e-news. And thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.